brother, where do you intend to go tonight? I heard that you missed your connecting flight to the Blue Ridge Mountain over near Tennessee. You're ever welcome with me anytime you like. Let's drive to the countryside, leave behind some green-eyed lookalike.
All right, get a glass of water if you need it. We're going to start in 60 seconds. Eventually make a way to the first 3 rows someplace. First 3 rows on this, maybe closer to this one. Maybe the first 4 rows, because Caleb looks so comfortable. First 4 rows in this section. In this section. All right, we're going to start in 30 seconds. 30 seconds to get water. 30 seconds to sit in the first 4 rows here. 20. 15 seconds. Sit in the first 4 rows. 12 seconds. 10 seconds. First 4 rows in this section. In this section. All right, guys. Tonight we're talking about the big God story. Remember, we talked about Adam. Remember Adam and Eve at the start of the story? And then we talked about Abraham, how God had a promise to redeem the whole world. Then we talked about Joshua, who went into the promised land, took over the land, but no one did what the Lord said. And last week we talked about Samson. We talked about the weakness of a very strong man and how there were judges that ruled the land, but pretty much everybody did what was right in their own eyes. The next person we're going to talk about is a great heroine in the Bible. And we are really excited to talk about Ruth tonight. And to give you an overview of what the book of Ruth is all about, watch this video.
The book of Ruth. It's a brilliant work of theological art, and it invites us to reflect on the question of how God is involved in the day-to-day joys and hardships of our lives. There are 3 main characters in the book: Naomi, the widow, Ruth, the Moabite, and Boaz, the Israelite farmer. And their story is told in 4 chapters that are beautifully designed. Let's just dive in and see how this all unfolds. Chapter 1 opens with this line, "In the days when the judges ruled." And it reminds us of the very dark and difficult days from the book of Judges. And here we meet an Israelite family in Bethlehem, struggling to survive through a famine. And so in search of food, they move on to the land of Moab, Israel's ancient enemy. And there the father of the family dies, and the sons marry 2 Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. And then the sons, they die too. And so they leave only Naomi and these new daughters-in-law. And so Naomi, she has no reason to stay anymore. And so she tells her new daughters-in-law that she's moving back home. And Naomi, she knows that the life of an unmarried foreign widow in Israel is going to be very hard. And so she compels the women to stay behind. Orpah agrees, but Ruth does not. She shows remarkable loyalty to Naomi, and she says, "Wherever you go, I'm going to go. Your people will become my people, and your God will become my God." And so the 2 of them return to Israel together. And the chapter concludes with Naomi changing her name to Mara, which means bitter in Hebrew, and she laments her tragic fate. Chapter 2 begins with Naomi and Ruth discussing where they're going to find food. And it just so happens to be the beginning of the barley harvest. And so Ruth goes out to look for food, and it just so happens that she ends up picking grain in the field of a man named Boaz, who just so happens to be Naomi's relative. We're told that Boaz is a man of noble character, and he notices Ruth. And so after finding out more about her story, he shows remarkable generosity to her. He makes these special provisions so that the immigrant Ruth can gather grain in his field. And in doing so, Boaz is actually obeying an explicit command of the Torah to show generosity to the immigrant and the poor. Boaz is so impressed by Ruth's loyalty to Naomi. He prays for her that God will reward her for her boldness. So Ruth comes home that day, and Naomi finds out that she met Boaz, and she is thrilled. She says Boaz is their family redeemer. Now, this family redeemer thing, this was a cultural practice in Israel where if a man in the family died and he left behind a wife or children or land, it was the family redeemer's responsibility to marry that widow, to take up the land and protect that family. So Naomi, she begins to hope that perhaps there might still be a future for her family. Chapter 3 begins with Naomi and Ruth making a plan to get Boaz to notice their situation. So Ruth is going to stop wearing clothes of a grieving widow, and she's going to show signs that she's available to be married. And so Ruth goes to meet Boaz on the farm that night. And as she approaches, Boaz wakes up and he's totally startled. And Ruth makes her intentions very clear. She asks if Boaz will redeem Naomi's family and marry her. Boaz is once again amazed by Ruth's loyalty to Naomi and her family, and he calls Ruth a woman of noble character. It's the same term used to describe the woman of Proverbs 31. So Boaz tells Ruth to wait until the next day, and he will redeem both Ruth and Naomi legally before the town elders. And so the chapter ends with Ruth returning to Naomi, and they marvel together at all of these recent events. In chapter 4, it all comes together. It turns out, at the last minute, Boaz discovers there is a family member who's closer to Naomi than he is, and he's actually eligible before him to redeem the family. But at the last second, this family member finds out that he's going to have to marry Ruth, the Moabite, and so he declines. But Boaz, remember, he knows Ruth's true character, and so he acquires the family property of Naomi, and he marries Ruth. And so just at the beginning, how Ruth was loyal to Naomi's family, so now Boaz is loyal to Naomi's family as well. The story concludes with a reversal of all of the tragedies from chapter 1. So the death of the husband and the sons is reversed as Ruth is married again and gives birth to a new son, granting joy to Naomi. And this symmetry between the opening and the closing, it's even more remarkable. So remember, the opening tragedy was followed by a great act of loyalty on the part of Ruth. And that is now matched by Boaz's act of loyalty that leads to the family's final restoration. And this symmetry, it highlights the design of the internal chapters as well. So each of the chapters begins with Naomi and Ruth making a plan for their future, and that's followed by a providential meeting between Ruth and Boaz, and each chapter concludes with Naomi and Ruth rejoicing at what's taken place. This story is beautifully designed, and that design actually connects with a really interesting feature of the story, and that's how little God is mentioned. Right? The characters talk about God a few times, but the narrator actually never once mentions God doing anything directly in the story, and that's its brilliance. Because God's providence is at work behind every scene of this story, weaving together the circumstances and choices of all these characters. So Naomi, her tragedy leads her to think that God is punishing her, but actually the whole story is about God's mission to restore her and her family. And he's doing so through Ruth, through her boldness and loyalty, which brings healing to Naomi's life, but not without Boaz, who's a no-nonsense farmer who's full of generosity and loyalty. And so God uses his integrity combined with Ruth's boldness to save Naomi and her family. And so this story brilliantly explores the interplay of God's purposes and will with human decision and will. God weaves together the faithful obedience of his people to bring about his redemptive purposes in the world. And that leads to the real end of the story. The book of Ruth concludes with a genealogy, showing how Boaz and Ruth's son, Oved, was the grandfather of King David, from whom came the lineage of the Messiah. And so all of a sudden, these seemingly mundane, ordinary events in this story are woven into God's grand story of redemption for the whole world. And so the book of Ruth invites us to consider how God might be at work in the very ordinary, mundane details of our lives as well. And that's what the book of Ruth is all about.
Okay, so it's on. Okay. So today, me and Hannah are going to be talking about the book of Ruth. But first, I'm going to start by talking about my journey in finding God. So, when I was younger, I didn't grow up in a home where we went to church, and I didn't know who Jesus was. And for a long time, my dad was drinking a lot, and my parents would argue all the time, and it was really difficult for me and my siblings. And then my Aunt Simona moved here from Washington, and she had always gone to church, so I started going with her and Izzy. And in 7th grade, I went to a summer camp with the church, and I gave my life to Jesus at chapel, I guess. And I came home, and I was really encouraged to bring my dad to church because I felt like it would put our family back together. And it was really hard to get him to come at first. But Jesus has done some amazing things since my dad started coming to church. My parents never argue anymore. It's a lot easier to talk things through with our family. And some huge things that have happened in my life were because I've started getting my family to go to church. And this last summer, I went on an amazing missions trip to El Salvador. And while I was there, I didn't really understand why I was there. Like, I knew I was there to spread the word of Jesus and, like, what he did for me and for all of us. But I wasn't quite sure why I was there. And so when I got home, I realized it was because he was showing me how grateful I need to be for what he's blessed me with and my family and all the amazing things that he's done in our lives. And this last summer, I got baptized, and it's changed my life, and I feel like I'm living how I'm supposed to be.
Okay, I've also had several turning points in my life. Well, I committed to Christ when I was really little, and then I had a baptism when I was about 12. And then a huge part of it is a big turning point in my life was the El Salvador missions trip. When I was there, I really was able to own my own faith and experience Jesus firsthand. And a big turning point that's coming up in my life is with colleges, and every single day that we have in high school is going to affect what college you can go to and what doors are open and what doors are closed. And I don't know, I think that's pretty nerve-wracking to think that doors can be opened and closed based off of just an SAT score or a few report cards. And another big part of my life, I feel like anytime I'm up here, I'm always talking about it, and it's FCA. And it really changed my life. It made me bolder in my faith, and I'm not afraid anymore to talk to students about it, or I'm working on not being afraid to talk to teachers about it. And but definitely, the bolder I am in my faith, I notice the more people respect your opinion on it, because they notice you can't be shaken on it, and so then they kind of find a respect in that about it. And that definitely changed a huge part of my life. So we all have significant points in our life where the decisions that we make can be good or bad, and it can make a huge difference in our future.
So the book of Ruth has 2 to 3 big turning points because of her decisions that ultimately affected history. So in Ruth chapter 1, verse 16 through 18, it says, "But Ruth replied, 'Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. So, turning back would have been easier for Orpah, which is her sister-in-law, where you, sorry. Orpah and Naomi both lost their husbands, and it would have been easier to surrender to death, and your dreams and faith would die. But because in their culture, without a male, they weren't really anything. But Ruth shows tremendous courage and loyalty to her mother-in-law and to God, who would have been destitute. This decision makes all the difference in her life and family. This is the turning point in Ruth's life. So, because she was so loyal to God and her mother-in-law, he was able to restore her family. So, because of her loyalty and he restored her family, she was also a descendant of King David and ultimately of Jesus. And she is a part of God's plan to redeem the whole world. So the decision to commit to God and to people is always a turning point in anybody's life.
Well, tonight might be a turning point for you. And so it'd be easier to just surrender to death and just let our dreams and our hopes and our faith die. But turning points in our life happen when we do the right thing. And technically, the right thing isn't always just the easy thing. And it's many times harder than the easy thing or the other option. And we can't let this scare us. And so we have a little demonstration to do. And both of us play water polo, and our coach, Coach Lowell, anytime we're on offense, he always says, press into the pressure. And we think that's kind of what God's telling us to do in our life also. So I'm going to talk like this. Okay, so I'm on offense, and Abby over here is on defense. And usually, we're over here for those that don't know what water polo is. You're in the water, and you have a ball. Okay. And so usually the defender is trying to get the ball, and what he doesn't want us to do, and what we believe God doesn't want us to do, just to leave, try to get a riskier, farther away shot. It's just not good offense. You don't want to be farther away from the goal. And so instead, what he wants us to do is he wants us to take that defender and take that pressure that she's giving us and turn into it until you're pressing and pressing and pressing. It's weird on land. And then turning out and shooting. So we believe that God kind of wants us to do that with the struggles that we face in our life and the turning points that are ahead of us. And so just press into the pressure and not be afraid of it. And don't be afraid of the harder option just because it's harder.
So, what would happen if we committed to God and the right people in our life? God's family is our family, and if we use the leverage of the turning point decisions, that those decisions will affect our lives tremendously. So, say in 5 years from now, some big decisions will be what college you're going to, who you're going to marry, what you plan to do with your life. So, if you use those people and God in your life to your advantage, he'll put you on the right path to where you need to go and to make the right decisions. So in Ephesians chapter 1, verse 5, it says, God decided in advance to adopt us into his own family by bringing us to himself through Jesus Christ. This is what he wanted us to do, and it gave him great pleasure. So tonight may be a big turning point in your life, the point at which everything changes.
All right, if you guys can just join me in prayer real quick, so bow your heads. Jesus, thank you so much for every single one of these students. Thank you for using Abby and I to speak your word and maybe just plant a little seed in those hearts to just also speak your word and be brave enough to get up here and do a tag team sermon. We all have turning points in our life that we're going to be facing, and just give us the strength and the courage to face them, and also just speak to us through it and show us your will. And let us not be surrendering to death, and let our dreams and hopes and failures and faith die, but just let us do the right thing, even when it's not the easy thing. And you know our hearts in this room, and so just be with us today, and let us have a good small group discussion about it. And thank you. In Jesus' name, amen.
Wow, you guys, really, really powerful message that you guys heard tonight, and I really appreciate the work you guys put into that. You know, you guys have really big turning point decisions that you're going to be making probably within the next 5 to 7 years. Some of you will be deciding who you're going to marry. Some of you are going to be deciding what career you're going to have. Some of you are going to be deciding what college you're going to go to. Some of you are going to decide what degree you're going to have. Some of you are going to decide who your best friend is. Some of you are going to decide if you're going to serve God or not. Those are big decisions. And as you're making those big decisions, you have to make smaller turning point decisions. Like, am I going to do the tag team sermon sometime or not? Am I going to go on the mission trip or not? Am I going to go to youth group or not? Am I going to participate in the small group discussion or not? Who is going to be my close friends that I'm particularly loyal to? All of these decisions are turning point decisions that change the whole trajectory of your life. And my prayer is that you make those decisions with a great amount of wisdom as God directs you, because they really do change everything. And that turning point decision of Naomi, the turning point decision for Abby coming to church, the turning point decision for Hannah going to El Salvador and getting involved in an FCA, you have turning point decisions that you're making right now that are really, really big. And so we want to talk about that in our small group. So we're going to break up in our small group, middle school boys, middle school girls, and then one high school group, I think, tonight.